Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, and welcome to Inspiration with the host. We had a little bit of a technical difficulty, but it worked out, and I'm so grateful. For the sake of time, I prayed off camera just to release a piece for myself and to bless those who are in attendance tonight. This is an amazing conversation that we have planned tonight. And I have one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, Ilona Gaspar, with me. And so I'm going to go over some of the information as it relates to her bio, which I must say reads like one of the amazing pieces of writing that we're used to in the Instagram writing community, which is how we met. And one of my favorite things about Ilona is her heart and how she cares and how she shares. And I've known her for so long. But it's interesting when we first met as writers in the Instagram writing community, how we all just kind of foster relationships is we do what's called tags. Tags means someone has a topic or someone has some type of a subject, and then you tag others in it to write about that. And then we all literally, and from a pure, genuine space, because we don't like the shade and and extra faces, we love one each other. And that's how we met. We met in a writing community. But one of the things I noticed about Ilona was there was a certain depth to her writing. I had never experienced anything like that before in my life. And even now, if you were to come across her work, and she's going to read one of her pieces later on tonight, which I'm excited about. Even now, if you come across her work, you know that as a poet and a writer, she's not writing from surface. She is intelligent, but she's also emotionally intelligent. And that reflects in her pen. So I'm going to read her bio and I'm going to let her talk a little bit more so we can get down to why we're all assembled tonight to talk about suicide, mental illness, and where other communities meet. So her bio reads as such. I, Ilona Gaspar, grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the daughter of a Japanese American world cultures teacher and a Gypsy Hungarian instrumental music teacher and strolling violinist. So fascinating. I grew up in an urban setting, but spent my summers and weekends in South Jersey in the heart of farm country. I was a definite tomboy, fishing, tromping through the woods, collecting bugs and tadpoles. I also baked with my great aunt and helped my grandma in the garden. My mom, being an educator, made sure I experienced museums and other cultures. I had the luxury of enjoying both settings. Being an only child, I had an active imagination. I started reading at 3. By 5, my library was folklore from around the world, mostly thanks to my mom. I started writing poetry around 6 and lyrics for my dad. But my life never appeared bad from the outside, she writes. There were troubles at home. At age 11, I attempted suicide, after which I was put in a juvenile clinic for a month. And there I was diagnosed with mild bipolar disorder. I was the youngest suicide case that had ever been there. The medication was never great. And 6 months later, I was pulled off everything. I learned to cope as best I could. And so that's part of her bio. I'm going to give her the floor to speak. One thing I do want to say is that suicide can be a very difficult conversation to have. This is a safe, non-judgmental, laid back environment. However, really important, if there is anything that you find triggering, anything that you find uncomfortable, anything that you find remotely overwhelming, no judgment here. If you need to tap out, if you need to pause and say, you know what, I thought I was ready to have this conversation, but I'm not, that is okay. Even now, if you're in crisis, you can call 800-273-TALK. Or if you don't feel like talking and you rather text someone, you can dial 741-741 to the crisis text line. And of course, if you're outside the States, you can also call or reach out to World Suicide Hotlines. Now, that's more so an easy Google to get a list of the different countries. So I just wanted to give you permission to breathe and permission to just relax. It's not going to be that kind of party here where you feel like you can't, like you have to dot your I's or cross your T's. Not in this space. That being said, I digress. I'm going to actually get out of the way so Ilona can have the floor. Ilona, it's all yours, Mama. I'm muting out my background.
Thanks, sis. Can you all hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So excuse my look. I've been cleaning all day and so my apartment's kind of crazy, but bear with me.
You're fine.
Yeah, I want to start off with thank you so much for having me. And I love you. Love you, love you.
Love you too, sis. Real talk. Real talk. Love you too.
So I'm probably going to cry. So I have a tissue ready because he always makes me cry. Like she did on her radio show. I didn't even know it was coming when she introduced me, and I was in tears by the time I started talking. So, so first off, I want to make a correction. I think I wrote 11, but it was actually 12.
Okay.
I did the math. And it was, I guess the most important thing to note is that I was an only child, and I grew up in a very, you can't find a more generous family. So I'm just prefacing all this with, I had a very loving Japanese American family that had gone through a lot, but I was the daughter of a first generation immigrant on my dad's side. And I'm also going to make a correction here. I've stopped using the term gypsy because I found out recently it means slave. So I am actually Romani, which is my dad was fourth generation settled there in Hungary. And then my mother was, well, she was a third generation Japanese American. She was actually born in Japan to a Japanese American mother and Issei, first generation father. They went back to Japan to have their first child. And my grandmother and her came back. My grandmother came back a widow at 22. And then they were pretty much almost immediately put into the camps. So I come from a hereditary line of tragedy. My dad escaped Hungary in 1956 during the Russian invasion of Hungary. He was 14 and alone at the time. His mother was abusive and very difficult, which is actually not uncommon in the Romani culture. So this was something I learned much later, and the Romani don't speak about being Romani. I didn't actually learn my dad was gypsy until I was 15, 16, and it was my mother who told me. So all that being said, at the age of 10, my mother was a very well-known world cultures teacher in the Philadelphia School District. And unfortunately, they were having marital troubles. And at 10 years old, I was the one who figured out, before I even understood what cheating was, that my dad was cheating on my mother. And I was the one who told her. So needless to say, that caused a lot of animosity and pain, and being an only in the middle of a very disastrous relationship. My earliest memories of them as a child, I think 2-3 years old, is them fighting. They always argued. And the joke in the family is that they fought on their first date, which was a blind date. They fought continuously, and still 4 years later, they got married. So we're not sure how that happened. There was definitely a lot of love and confusion on my side because I was too young to understand all those adult things. I was 10. So a couple of years later, I had the summer of a child's life. I went to Hawaii with my grandmother to see my uncle and my cousins. My uncle was on sabbatical there. A friend of mine took me to Bermuda. I had been in California. So I did a lot of traveling that summer. It should have been amazing. And I remember, I think it was just, I'm not even really sure where it came about. I just hit this moment of depression. And I don't think I was understanding, well, I knew I wasn't understanding the bipolar. Of course, when the diagnosis came, it was kind of a mess because my mom didn't like the idea of me being on medications for life. And the medications they had at that time were basically lithium, which is, if you've ever read about it or know anything about it, it's a deadener. I guess that's the best way to put it. So it deadens all emotions. You can't feel joy, you can't feel sad, you can't feel anything. So at 12 years old, I was a zombie, for lack of a better word. I didn't have emotions for a good 6 months. And finally, my mom got fed up with it and told the doctors what they could do with it. And they said, this is dangerous, you know that. So this was all after the suicide attempt. And it was a night my mom was out, and I'm guessing she was at her best friend's house. And I basically swallowed a half a bottle, approximately 60 tablets of aspirin. That was the only thing I could think of that would ease the pain. Aspirin was supposed to ease the pain. And in a 12-year-old's mind, that was the best way to do it. And I became violently ill. My dad was in their bedroom watching, like sleeping and watching TV. And I was in my room getting sick and being nauseous, kept running to the bathroom. And I had a beagle at the time, my sweet little coffee, who I loved. And I remember snuggling with her in my bed, and the cramping was really getting bad. And she was looking at me, and I remember thinking really, really, really hard that this wasn't supposed to be that way. And she looked at me with these big eyes and just snuggled at me. And this would be the first time in my life an animal saved my life, which is why I love my dog so much. And she just looked up at me, and all I could think was, I can't go yet. This hurts too much, and I'm not supposed to leave her. And so I told my dad what happened, and I was rushed to CHOP, Children's Hospital, Philadelphia. And I just remember them making me drink this really horrible, horrible charcoal thing. I guess I was a little too soon for those stomach pumping, thankfully. But it was basically a black drink that tasted of really horrible cherries. And the next thing I knew, after the chaos of everything, and I remember my mom rushing in because she wasn't home when all this had occurred. My dad had got me to the ER. And I remember her, she started to yell at me. And I don't remember what she said, but I remember her tone. And I think it was her friend who pulled her back. And I woke up probably a couple hours later, and my head was in my mother's best friend's lap, and she was stroking my hair. And in that moment, that was the most loved I'd felt and the most seen I'd felt. And it's funny because I grew up in a family that was generous and loving, and it wasn't that there was really anything wrong. It's just that nobody saw me. I was always the princess. My grandmother and the dynamics of the family were very set. My mother was the oldest and the only daughter from her father, and they had gone into the war. They'd gone into the camps. My mother was 2 or 3. So here's my grandmother, the oldest of 7. She's a widow at 22, and she has an infant child, and her 6 siblings and her parents were kind of in this very Japanese scenario of, this looks bad to have a widow so young with a child. And so my aunt who married my uncle always said that they kind of circled the wagons, and they found another man because my grandmother's first marriage was arranged. And so of course they arranged a second one. My mother didn't find out she was adopted till she was 18. And then her brother was born in Poston in the initial camp they were in. And my aunt was born just after the war, when they were sharecropping through the South, making their way to New Jersey. So my grandmother and my mother always had this very unique relationship that caused a lot of kind of back and forth. My mother was also very close to the siblings because it's basically she had grown up with them. And so in turn, I also had that same relationship with my grandmother where I could talk back to her and she wouldn't give me, well, she'd give me the evil eye, but it was not like the same way. And I had a much more casual relationship with her that was still built in a lot of respect. I mean, my grandmother was definitely a matriarch, but that Japanese influence always kind of was there in all of that. And then here's my dad, who is, a survivor he spent 3 years in an Italian refugee camp after he escaped before being recruited to come to the United States. So there's a lot of history that led up to this feeling of when my mom found out about the cheating. I'm sorry, I'm kind of all over the place here, but when she found out about the cheating, she went to her family circle and her best friends. And she dragged me along to a lot of the things. Like when she called the other woman, I remember picking up the other line back when we had one line in the home and listening. And the woman went to the door at one point and my mom said, "Are you there?" She knew I was on the phone. And she said, "You know who that is at the door." And she took me with her when we dragged my dad back from his apartment. And I had been growing up my whole life with my dad leaving every few months for a few days. They would fight, he would leave. I found a diary that I wrote when I was 6, where I literally started rhyming words. And the first one in there at 6 years old was, "Here I lie, here I die, here I cry." And I'd like to think it was just for the rhyming that I chose that word, but those words and those sounds. But I think it was more than that. I think by 6, I already knew I was the outsider in a 3-person family.
Ilona,
And
if I may, first of all, I'm literally holding on to every word. I'm not joining you on screen yet because I do want you to kind of touch back on something, if I may. One of the things that you made mention of when your mom had learned of your attempt, her response.
yes,
So I want to talk about that, but also one of the things that you said was so powerful is because of how it looked, because it looked bad. And one of the things that came up in our last session, the suicide in families of color and the surviving families' response, we heard a reoccurring theme that said, what goes on in this house stays in this house. So there seems to be a running theme as it appears to appearance. And I want you to kind of touch on that and how you think that affects the person who made the attempt or just needs someone to talk to.
Oh, and you are so reading my mind because I watched the last one and that was something that I made a note about too, because it was definitely in my experience. And I think it was Steve in the first one talked about feeling unseen and unheard,
Yes.
right? And so this is a common theme, I think, across the board for those that attempt and those that go through and finalize, is that there's finally nobody there to stop them. And it's either they stop themselves somehow, and that takes a lot of energy. And if you have a mental illness and you're young, then that's a really tough thing to do. And so my mother's reaction wasn't, I think it's actually fairly universal, especially for the communities of color, because culturally, you know, the Asian cultures are very quiet in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a lot of fire under there, but they're definitely very quiet. Their business is their business. They don't like to spread it around. They, you know, plus I think the added pressure for the Asian community, at least, is being the model minority, right? We are supposed to be up there with white people, supposedly. And I can tell you, as a person that's biracial and bisexual, and by a lot of things, you know, I have always been outside. I have always been the perpetual outsider. Though I may fit in to a lot of groups, when it comes down to the core basics of how you live your life, I really never had a community, so to speak. So community I've always done on my own. Even my cousin says that, because from her mother's side, she was supposed to get that. And my mother's side was really this Japanese American, you know, is a much stronger tie to the Japanese American side. But my dad's side was Romani, and we didn't really know that family. And they were also very secretive. And so there was a lot of like not knowing who I was and where I stood and what was my core. And the funny thing is, when we talk about the whole believing thing, my mom was very spiritual and she knew the Bible backwards and forwards. And she loved to sing. You would have loved her with her. She did not have the greatest voice, but she loved to sing. And my dad used to play for a lot of the churches here in Philadelphia as a violinist. And I was dragged to every one of them. I went to a Quaker school. My parents were married in a Unitarian church right on Chestnut Street. And my aunt and my mother were technically Protestant. My dad was technically Catholic. My dad's mentor, who was my godfather, was Jewish. And that was the only church that would baptize me. And oddly enough, my godfather, the Jewish man, told my mother I needed to be baptized when she had me, which my mom had no idea what that was. And so they went back to the church where they were married and had me baptized. But like I said, I went to a Quaker school. I grew up in Philadelphia in University City. So I was surrounded by so many different churches, and 75% of my school was Jewish. So I went to more bar and bat mitzvahs than I can count. I can still say part of the Torah.
Right.
So like, you know, you pick up, I remember going to lots of Baptist churches, and I think it's not so much for me that, because I was always into spirituality and the Eastern religions and Buddhism and all of it. But I don't think I felt comfortable. And a big part of this was after my dad strayed.
Mhm.
My mom started dragging us to every church on Sunday until I rebelled. And especially because it was Episcopalian. Episcopalian is boring. And I did not want to go there on Sundays. And I really, I think I developed this kind of need to be separate from an organized situation. When I got into tarot and
Mhm.
the metaphysical, I found I was studying a lot on my own. I tended to find things, but this is why the cults never got me.
Right.
Was because I had a few places that tried to recruit me into their cults. I later found out they were cults. I was 16 at the time, even was allowed to go up to New York with this woman and meet this man. And I found him fascinating and got the whole why people were drawn to him, but I just never got sucked into that because it was very important to be on my own because I always felt like I raised myself. And when you're 12 and your parents are bickering and fighting and leaving you alone at home a lot to repair their marriage, which they don't remember doing, but every weekend from the age of 11 on, I was pretty much alone at home.
Let me say this to you, if I may. One of the things you touched on is being alone and feeling as though you are alone. Excuse me.
Mhm.
Being alone and feeling as though you are alone, that isolation that comes up, even though you are around countless people. And the
Mhm.
fact that you said it wasn't until after your suicide attempt, you laid, you woke up finding your head laying in the lap of your mother's best friend, who, based on what you said, if I heard you correctly, and I'm paraphrasing, and correct me if I'm saying it wrong, she basically played the role of a buffer that night because of your mom's
Yes,
response.
yes,
But when you were speaking, you also touched a little bit on being bipolar. And
yes.
so how we came up with this, for those of you who are just joining us, how we even landed in this space is because of Ilona and I having the connection for years. Both of us are similar in the fact that we have to feel safe when we share. And we're so very different, but we have a lot in common when it comes to taking care of each other's heart, being respectful for each other as to and for each other as peers and as women. And I learned so much from you, Ilona, when you were talking about like when the movement of Stop Asian Hate and Black Lives Matters and all of these things were coming up. And you and I were having these deep conversations and touching base and checking on each other. And how we even got to the title of this particular session is you taught me about what it really means to be a part of othered communities and dealing with suicide and dealing with mental illness. And for those of you who don't know my background, I don't have a clinical background. I've been a volunteer in suicide crisis for a long time. But for me, what made me become very passionate about raising awareness in suicide is that when I was working as a volunteer on the suicide and crisis hotline, I worked a lot of different shifts. And then when I would work on Sundays after church, people were calling the suicide hotline on the way home from church. So that's, and me and you've talked about that, Ilona, before. I'm like, that's what made me go, what are we doing wrong? What are we missing that people are in crowded areas, crowded rooms with a lot of, bear hugs and smiles and hey girl, and feeling alone. And so you are the one that taught me in terms about even representing the Asian community. Can you do that when we're dealing with blended families, when we're dealing with multi-ethnic, multiracial communities, and how that even affects how we approach this conversation? So I want you to explain other communities and what that looks like for everyone. But then I do want us to talk about the diagnoses of being bipolar, and then we'll move into sharing the piece that you wrote, because I want to give you space to
Absolutely.
flow. I want to respect your writing gift too while we're here. So I'm listening, Mama. Go ahead.
So I thought about that, about what does it actually mean to be other? And there's actually, I don't know if anybody watches The Daily Show, but they brought on I forget his name. It's failing me now, but they have an Asian guy on there, and I think he's Chinese. I want to say he's Chinese or Korean. And there's a short on YouTube, actually, of the Daily Show of his conversation about being Asian in America. And there's this sense of, and he calls it being othered. We are forever othered. If you always, when you are Asian, there's no hiding that you're Asian, right? Like it's really hard. It's one thing to talk about skin color and having lighter tones and things like that, but we have definitive features that separate us that are very easy to see. And, you know, I think that that whole other of, I grew up with the question of what are you? Which a lot of people in other communities feel weird about it, or they think it's rude. I got so numb to it, I guess, that I actually started to find it funny. And I would just say guess, because nobody could ever guess this mix.
Right.
I knew that. So I've been called Spanish, I've been called Native American, I've been called, you know, Filipino, like I get everything you can think of. And then you add my name, which nobody can say or spell correctly. And it sounds like aloha. So I've been called that a lot. So I get that a lot. But I think the whole concept of othered is not just in being mixed race or everything like that, but you add in like the LGBTQ, trans plus, which I wanted to talk about a little bit too.
Yes.
Because
you have room to flow.
Yeah, I came out when I was 16 to my mother. That was not taken well. I was assumed, because I said I was bisexual, that clearly I was a fence sitter, which the community, the LGBTQ community, when I went to college, bi people were considered not real. We were obviously these kind of people that just didn't see it. Now they have all kinds of new terms for bi, that, you know, which I find interesting. But I pulled up some statistics because I think this was really important. So coming from the juvenile and the other community, I looked at a couple of things. So number one, the US suicide ranks 10th as the leading cause of death. These statistics are from the 2018 stats on the CDC, National Health Center for Health Statistics. It is the second leading cause of death amongst people ages 10 to 34. If people did not know that, that is a really big statistic. Look at that age group, 10 to 34, second leading cause. And it's fourth for people between the ages of 35 to 44. 1 in 6 US youths ages 6 to 17 experience a mental health disorder each year. And 50% of our lifetime mental illness begins at the age of 14, 75% by the age of 24. These are young people that are incapable of understanding what's happening to their brain. I was incapable of understanding what was happening to me. I was seen as dramatic by my family. And actually, one thing that was really interesting with my aunt, after my ex-husband left, my family kind of, I know my cousin told me that my uncle and my aunt kind of re-looked at me in a new light. And she had been talking to her mom. Her mom had sent me a letter, actually, apologizing for not being there when I was younger, for being so in her own head and in her 30s, not understanding that I was just looking for an adult to save me from my parents, to hear me, to drag me out of whatever was happening. That's all I wanted. That was the only thing I wanted, was to be seen and heard and saved, because I was incapable of knowing what was going on. And my uncle said to my cousin, not long after that, her and I went to dinner, and she told me her dad like had kind of this revelation in front of her And it wasn't prompted by anything, but he actually said, I think all these years he said, I don't think we fully understood what she was going through.
Tell me about Ilona, if I may, the when you said doesn't understand what she was going through and not being understood, I'm hearing again that we as adults, and of course you and I are talking
Mhm.
now as adults, there's something that we seem to miss when it comes to children.
Mhm.
Kind of touched on this on the other night when we talk about micromanaging for the
Right.
sake of appearances.
Mhm.
I want to give you an opportunity to read your piece about the bipolar diagnoses and what that actually feels like. But before you read that, and you have that as well, the poem.
Right. Well, yeah, it's more about where I was just a couple of years ago.
Okay. Do
Like
you
with
still
that.
feel comfortable sharing that? Because I want to be
Yeah,
respectful of whatever
absolutely.
you feel
Absolutely.
comfortable sharing. Okay. So
Absolutely.
before we do that, tell me about when did you actually receive the bipolar diagnoses? When did you actually receive that? And was that something else that was kind of shunned? Because I know you made mention of the medication
Well,
and feeling numb, but I'm not clear if that was at the same
right.
time.
So the diagnosis came out, I was in the clinic. I don't know if you remember this out on Roosevelt. There used to be a Friends,
Yes, yes.
okay.
Friends Hospital
So
is still there up
Friends
the boulevard.
Hospital, and they had
Yeah.
a clinic, specifically a juvenile clinic,
Okay.
which was sort of like jail. All the
Mhm.
doors were locked. We weren't allowed in our rooms during the day. They took away shoelaces, belts, anything sharp. We
Mhm.
joked the sharps. Like I said, I was the youngest person there. So I kind of got adopted by some of the older kids.
Mhm.
But I was there for a month and I had weekly sessions with my parents, with the psychologist there. And it was that psychologist that the first visit with my parents,
Yes, ma'am.
he told them I was bipolar or mildly bipolar. And I remember that my mother just kind of looked at him blankly.
Got it.
Um, so I don't think they really fully understood. Um, and it's interesting because I felt very capable all my life of handling it, but then I was incorrectly diagnosed Prozac in 2015 after the ex left, and I was having depressive episodes, and I begged my
Okay.
doctor for an antidepressant, not
Mhm.
realizing that Prozac is not good for bipolars.
Mm.
And it caused a massive panic attack and threw my bipolar into full swing. So
Oh.
not only was I dealing with PTSD, but I had a massive breakdown. And my counselor is the one that caught it because I put myself into therapy to the thanks of my cousin who found me the Chestnut Hill College, something I could afford, $5, a visit. And they're overseen, they're students, but they're overseen
Yes.
by a psychologist. And she noticed this dramatic change in from literally one week to the next. And I was crying in the office and I was a mess. And I told her about the panic attack. And she was just like, okay. And then the next week I went back and she's like, how are you feeling? And I was still like in tears and everything. And she's like, Prozac is not, she's like, were you ever diagnosed with bipolar?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, yeah, when I was 12, I attempted suicide. And she's like, children who attempt suicide typically, like when they're that young, there's usually a mental illness factor behind it.
Wow.
And she said, Prozac is really bad for bipolars. It is not to be given to bipolars.
Mm.
So she encouraged me to talk to my doctor and get off of it. And I stopped taking it. And it took about 6 weeks to get it all out of my system. And I was still a little off, and it's been off since, but it's still, it destroyed me. Like I was literally back to suicidal, and I had not been suicidal after my ex left. My dad was so terrified I would go back to that place. He wanted to take away my pain medications for my knee surgery
Wow.
stuff. And he was so worried about it. But I was like, I'm not suicidal. I don't want to kill myself. I have Hazel to look after. I don't want to
Right.
Never do that to her. And, but in that 2 weeks of taking the Prozac, I was right back to, I want to end it all. I don't belong here. Can I drive my car right
Right.
off this highway into that big pole there? And, I mean, I was a mess. It was amazing. I got to a parking lot, was able to call somebody from that panic attack. But
You sound as though you are, and I apologize. I want to be respectful of what it is you're saying, but there
Mhm.
are certain questions I do want to address. One of the things that you sound as though you've been very consistent in doing is somehow learning how to advocate for yourself for such a long time. I mean, and
You have to.
but I
You
but I
have
think
to.
but what yeah, but see, it's weird because we will get either a second opinion or do our homework when it comes to physical health.
Mhm.
Be it something like, say, for example, if you're dealing with migraines, or if you're
Mhm.
dealing with um, uh, a heart condition, you want to try to get the weight off and, abstain from certain foods. And we just kind of take these blanket pieces of advice. But when it comes to our mental health and our emotional health, I think there's something that we're missing, that we just kind of brush it off. You know what I mean? And then on top of it, there's such a stigma associated with trying to get help. What would you say to someone who's new at navigating the waters of attempting to advocate for themselves, even as a grown person? And sometimes we're afraid or embarrassed as adults to ask questions that we feel we may have missed an opportunity to ask when we were younger. But what would you say before you read your piece about, the piece that you wrote? I really want you to touch on that because there are people who are listening and will see this at a later time, and everything that you're saying just feels so encouraging because it speaks to them, but also new.
So I'm going to answer kind of backwards because
Okay.
you also asked me another question about what do we do for children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it's just me. I was always kind of I think because I had to raise my parents in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
because I was an only child and no adults were coming to save me. My only thing, I think you remember, I posted a poem about my great aunt. She was my soft place to
Like
land.
your angel, I remember.
And so I wrote this whole poem about her because she comes to me. And the title of that was Show You. Um, and so anyway, so I think she was the one that she tried really hard to shelter me,
Mm-hmm.
to move me out of the room when my parents were fighting, when they were adjusting. I think my grandmother tried to some extent too, but they just didn't know how to deal with me. And I remember having a complete breakdown around 11 at my grandmother's home
Mm-hmm.
with my cousins there, throwing things and having this massive tantrum.
Yeah.
And it terrified my cousins. I know that. And it terrified my grandmother. And I think that's where the whole, oh, she's dramatic and all this
Mm-hmm.
stuff came from. And again, it goes back to what they weren't hearing, what they weren't seeing, what they weren't understanding
Got it.
about that. So when you see a kid acting out like
Yeah.
that, and I was a teacher, briefly
Yes.
for the school district, and part of my student teaching for Drexel
Mm-hmm.
I had to choose certain students, and I went to their homes and I spoke with their parents and from all over the spectrum of it, right? So, and I was teaching over on Girard, so
Right.
very like 99.9% African
African
American.
American. Yeah.
So I remember this one kid who was my brightest student. I mean, just the most handsome little, sweet little, beautiful boy. And his parents, super nice. And I remember getting there for the first visit, and he was sitting in the corner facing the wall. And I kind of looked, and she's like, he's in a timeout right
Mm-hmm.
now. And I asked her why, and she said, well, he broke the DVD player. And she's like, and I don't know what to do with him. He broke the fan last week and he broke this. And so I looked at her and I said, well, did you ever ask him why? And she kind of looked at me, and this bright woman, I mean, she's
Sure.
not, these are like sweet kids. They obviously love their son. This was nothing like an abusive situation or anything. And he was very bright and excelled. And so they brought him out of the corner and he sat down with me and he was like, "Hi, Miss G." And, just his sweet little polite self. And I looked at him and I said his name and I said, "So your mom told me that you broke the, the DVD player." And I was like, "Can I ask why?" And he said, "Well, I wanted to see if it would play."
Hmm.
And I said, "Play what?" And he said, "Well, I put a penny in there." So he had tried to play the penny because he wanted to see if the penny would play. So this is the curiosity of a child. And here his parents were punishing him. So I asked him, "What about the fan?" And he said, "I wanted to know why it turned." And these are really simple answers, child answers. And I looked at his mother and she just was like, she had like tears. And I was just like, "So he's curious." And she was like, "I had no idea." She's like, "I just thought he was breaking stuff."
Acting out.
Exactly. And the thing is that I think we forget to ask why with kids, and especially, and I think this is a big factor. I did want to bring up this one stat that I read that LGBTQ kids are 4 times more likely to attempt, and trans are 12 times.
What can we do better, Ilona?
And so we can do better by listening, definitely. And I heard this brought up in your last one. I did watch. So listening, and I think people look for the usual suspects, right? Like they look for, oh, they're giving away their stuff. They were always angry, and now they're kind of at peace, right? Things like that. But I think we have to look a little deeper than that, even, is that what is the scenario at home that we're not seeing? And what is it that they don't understand? And if you see them acting out, it's not a bad thing to go, why? Because the why is what they can't establish, especially at those young ages. I don't think you're capable of it. And I learned very early, my mom got very, very sick when I was 18. And she was sick for 19 years of my life. And I learned very quickly to advocate on her behalf when I went to the hospitals, because I was noisy and I was able to stand up for myself to a certain extent, because I had to fight back to my dad and fight back to my mother, because I was always in the middle between them. And it was constantly like a situation of being an adult too fast. And I think we find that with a lot of children in these scenarios, they're navigating mental illness and being adulted too fast. If that's not a word, but you get what I mean. Like they're basically thrown into these adult situations very quickly, and it's assumed that they can handle it, and they can't. They haven't been equipped yet. So either they fall on their face and figure their failures, and then they take that leap we never want them to take.
Right.
Or they wallow and they just become that bad kid, that kid who never amounts to anything or doesn't find their significance or whatever, or they have to struggle and scrap and fight their whole life, and they feel so alone while doing it.
So
and that support.
I apologize. I didn't mean to bump into you. I want to be respectful of the time. No, you're fine. I didn't mean to bump into you. But there's something that you said that made me think about not only asking why, but also it makes me think, Ilona, about how you hear that term, they just want attention.
Yeah.
They're just acting out because they want attention. Even with people who deal with self-harm, because I don't have personal experience, I do a lot more listening than talking. And even if I had personal experience, which I don't, I have learned enough to know that it's important to not generalize, because everyone's situation is unique. But that is a common thread that I hear a lot about, how when it comes to someone who may be dealing with self-harm or even dealing with injuring themselves in any way, it's not necessarily that they want attention, and it's not even necessarily so that they're suicidal. I was made to understand, hey, Erica, at the end of the day, it's the one thing that they can control.
Yes.
That is so
I,
powerful.
I started smoking when I was
Mhm,
11, stealing my mom's cigarettes.
mhm.
And I was a full pack a day smoker by the time I was 15. And
Amazing. Yeah.
I burned myself on my wrists with cigarettes. And I went through a lot of self-harm stages, and I began overeating. I was a very active kid. I was an Olympic level swimmer. I mean, there were a lot of pressures too, because in the Asian culture, you go right through school, you have to excel. I went to Friends Central on the main line. So
Okay.
we're talking like, see, my parents mortgaged
They
their
would
house
not,
twice to get me through there. They were
I hear
not
you.
exactly rich, you know. I was from the poor side
Mhm,
of
mhm.
that group. And I went through all 12 years there. I got into Central and, you know, Kappa and all these other places.
Yes, remember we had
I
that
was going to
conversation.
move into high school, yeah, but
Mhm,
it, like, I was terrified of that big school setting. But oh, you know, ultimately, like, there's a lot of pressure on kids to be and live a life that is set before them, that there's a
mhm,
precision and timing. And again, you know, there is that need to kind of dismiss it as, oh, they're attention seekers, or oh,
mhm,
they
mhm.
do this. And my family did it. I mean, that's what my uncle was realizing, was
Yeah,
that I wasn't acting out because I wanted to. Well, I mean, I was bipolar, so
sure.
I didn't have control over it at all.
Mhm,
And I didn't know to go this way or that way. But I think for most kids, and again, going, like, looking at the stats that I looked at, it is
yeah,
amazing how many, especially in the communities of color,
mhm.
are suffering from mental illnesses so young. And if we don't see it, if we miss those signs, we miss out on the chance to help them.
Ooh, this is
And
so
that's the
important.
thing, is it's not always really obvious. It's not really obvious necessarily, because just because, oh, they're acting out. It's sometimes it's the quiet ones, the ones that are stewing so much in their head. And the only people who see it might be their parents, or it might be, you know, or might be their siblings. And it's erratic changes in their behavior, and maybe the outside world never sees it.
Mm,
And so there always needs to be someone outside the the core family that needs to be available to them, whether it's, you know, I hate to put teachers in this position because we see them, you know, outside. And I mean, I've known kids that were, you know, clearly stuff was not great at home. They were acting out, and they were clearly becoming bullies. And that was their road, because nobody was giving them any sort of restrictions or standards
mhm.
or structure at home, right? Because it was just, they wanted them to not, they wanted to relieve themselves of guilt. And I think as adults, I see this a lot, and I saw
Mhm.
this with my parents, and I saw this with my family. The adults in your life are in, I mean, and this is not their fault. It's not
Sure.
anyone's fault. It's they're dealing with their own stuff.
People can
You
only give
still
you what they
have
have,
that.
though. I apologize,
Exactly.
but people can only give you what they have.
Absolutely. They can
So,
only give to that level.
right.
That's
So
all
what
they
happens
can.
is, I apologize. So what happens is that when you have a parent, and when I'm older, I will never do this. When I have my children, I will never
Oh
do this.
yeah.
And we end up repeating these same patterns. And then even when we deal with relationships, and we deal with heartbreak, and we deal with betrayal, we deal with narcissism, you end up finding yourself
Mhm.
as an adult in these relationships, and you're looking to people who do not have any idea how to love you because they're giving you what they have. They are
Right.
literally giving you what they have.
And you don't know how to accept what you're getting as the only thing, because that's the
Right.
only thing you ever learn to get. So you end
Exactly.
up in the same scenarios over and over again. It's always that repeating cycle.
Yeah,
And
good word,
yeah,
cycle. That's what I was
there it
thinking.
is. It's that cycle.
Interrupting the
I think,
cycle.
right. I think as people, especially when you're a friend of the family or something, if you see something happening with the parents that you're friends with, because this is the thing my aunt was apologizing to me for. She was so wrapped up in her difficulties with my mom that when they butted heads, and her mother dying and all these things that were her own things, that nobody saw me. They were blind to the kid in the middle, and they didn't want to get involved because they didn't want my mom to get involved with their relationship like she always did. And they didn't want, my aunt to get involved. Like they didn't want to get in, like they basically specifically decided to stay out of each other's relationships. But in doing that, they left me out, and they left me unseen and unheard and unprotected. And so even now they kind of understand, they know that I distanced myself from the family after my mom died. And it hurts my cousin a lot. I know that because especially during all this public nonsense, I've removed myself even more, and I just go more and more into isolation, because once my dad passes and when my mom passed, I knew my ties to that family were going to be pretty much there. And my cousin always kind of knew that my life was harder than the rest of the families, that I was always kind of seen in this very princess, that I was the special princess and I was spoiled rotten. Everybody thought I was spoiled, that I'd never heard the word no. And I was like, if you only heard how many times I heard nothing. I didn't need to hear no, I heard nothing.
Ilona, give me a minute, girl, because you are hitting on so much, and we are short on time.
I know,
No, because you and I, we literally can talk all night.
we can.
We have done it before. Like, whoo, okay, whoo, what time is it? You sleep? No. Let's pause here. I do want to check the chat to see if there are any questions, any comments. If you all have any questions at all for Ilona, please, this is the time to put that in there. And yes, there are comments about your story, how it's very impactful, and how we're missing opportunities to talk to our children, but more so hear them instead of talking. And like I used to always say, let's talk to them, not talk at them, right? But how that affects us even as adults. If you have any other additional questions or comments, please don't hesitate to put them in there. I do want to hear your piece, because you asked me, you said, can I share? And I said, absolutely you can. And we're going to get ready to wrap up in a little bit. But please, I want to hear your piece and tell us a little bit background. You mentioned this is how you feel through the lens of a bipolar person, but this was written only in 2018, if I heard you correctly.
Right. So I wrote this on my Blue Lotus Kamikaze Heart page in 2018. I actually started that page in end of 2017, I think. And this was kind of in the middle of the year, and I think it was a really, I don't know if it's just the struggle with bipolar. I think it was just really this kind of struggle in general. How I've always carried things through my life and how I viewed it. So I'll read it. It's called Powder Keg. And I think this has mostly to do with if anybody knows anything about bipolar is essentially a dramatic form of, it's a dramatic rewiring of the brain. So PTSD rewires your brain, as do all mental illnesses. Bipolar has very low lows and very high highs. And you waver between the two depending on this. And we talked about health a little bit earlier. So I was recently diagnosed as B12 deficient, which is actually, well, it could have been triggered by a whole lot of things, including the prescriptions that were given to me as a kid. So this B12 deficiency can cause basically debilitating loss of the nerves and function, like MS and lupus. And it's incredibly serious. And it's caused by, I think, between the diabetes, which is also as a medication that causes this. So I encourage anybody out there who is suffering from mental illness or diabetes or anything where you might be taking something, please, please, please get yourself checked for B12, because I found a lot of stabilization once I started taking B12 mentally, which was the first thing I noticed. And that was huge. So I want to bring that up.
Yes, ma'am.
And again, yeah, I fight with my doctors because I learned. Alrighty, so bear with me. I don't read often in front of people. Submerged in black gunpowder and kerosene, I have learned to breathe in the ethylene. Lungs clean and vaccinized by the nicotine of copious cancerous lies I've bestowed on my soul. I've let hopelessness live in the layers of my bones as they lay waiting for the angel's kiss of death that smells of home. Promises pray for the breath, carried by 1,000 wildflowers swayed in the breeze, and the faltered squeeze on a heart that struggles to receive. If only I could stay steadfast in my beliefs, to not bow to the raging fires within. But flesh is fickle and demons whisper of the sin, that a life unled is a life lived dead. Perhaps if I stopped listening to the kamikaze dreams in my concussion-filled head, I wouldn't be loving the ghost-filled side of my hand-me-down bed. With every turn and toss on the cross I bear, with every nightmare reminds me of every precarious loss and every painful word read, still I breathe, because there is nothing else I can do but to live and to love while I snuff out the fuse of this powder keg.
I'm over here trying to follow along with you. You should see me, which you can. I'm literally trying to follow along with you, because when you sent it to me, I just kept shaking my head. And you know how you, well, I do. I talk back to the screen. I don't know how much you talk back to the screen, but I'm over here. Yes, yes. And I'm following along, right along with you, with what you sent to me, describing that. And I commend you on so many levels. I know I'm going to go to the chat, but I commend you on so many levels. You're being here. You are seen, Ilona.
Thank you. I love you. I love you so much.
I love you too.
And it was Jordan that brought us together.
Right.
I'm grateful for that.
Ooh, don't get me started.
I know.
Can I say that? Can I mention that?
Oh yeah.
He was one of our fellow writers in the Instagram writing community,
Promoter.
Right, which is how me and Ilona met. And I started sharing on Authenticity Speaks, and he passed away a couple of years ago. And he was somebody that was very special. And it's so weird, people go, it's just, you tag someone, you like their comment. Hey, you, awesome. You're a rock star. Oh, that was a great piece. I love it. You go, girl. And you can, Ilona, you and I both, when we know if you're not genuine and sincere, you can have a million exclamation points. We're like, yeah.
Dorothy was an uplifter and a promoter.
Exactly. So
and a believer.
That's
he
right.
Loved you.
I adored him.
Yeah, he loved you.
And for us to become connected like that to people who we have writing in common, and writing was a source of healing for me. And you know, I'm still writing, you're still writing, but I mentioned all of that to say, to be heard and to be seen is so important in any setting. You know,
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
shared from children how Ilona felt seen, unseen, excuse me, and then when she felt seen, what a pivotal moment that was for her. But then even as adults, you know, we all want to be heard, we all want to be seen. And she talked about not only her diagnoses, but dealing with being bisexual and what acceptance looks like and communicating her needs. And then this is how the conversation of othered communities came up. And how we have, pardon me, how we have a very bad habit, and I say we, and I'm referring to humanity, we have a very bad habit of, well, if you're not like me, forget you. And I'm gonna wait until you're like me and then we can get along. No, there's beauty in differences. There's a beauty in just appreciating and loving people for who they are. And not everyone has earned the right to be, how can I say it? Not everyone has earned the right for the connection to move offline.
Mhm.
Right, Ilona? You know,
Yeah,
when
no,
you have
absolutely.
people who, you know, they come from a genuine space, and you know that God has, or the universe, as Ilona would say, right, has brought us
Universe,
has brought us together, right? My language, her
source,
language is
whatever you
different,
want to
right?
call it.
Right, however you want to call it. Um, and how we just miss the opportunity to be respectful and learn from each other. And that's why I adore you, because when you and I connect and when we bust it up and we chop it up and we just talk, we listen, and this is a running theme for community. Going to the chat because I want to be respectful of the time.
I saw a couple questions come up.
Yeah, give me one moment. Amen. I'm reading the comment about how we are. Thank you so much for, I'm going to read this. I applaud you, Erica, on dealing with this missed issue in many children and adults, suicide in communities of color. We must stop, amen. We must stop judging others based on our lack of understanding of what children or adults have gone through, but not able to express due to perception to be perfect. Girl, that'll preach on a million levels. That'll preach a million times over. The good thing my tambourine is all the way over there because I play a mean tambourine. Y'all not ready. I applaud you, Ilona, for speaking your truth. You are being healed. I love that. You and I, we talk about that, how healing comes in many forms. There was a question, Ilona, did your sexuality drive you further into bipolar issues? Great
Oh, that's a
question.
good question. That is
Yeah.
a great question. So I was a teenager when I came out. So I was actually, no, I'm trying to think about it. I was in college. I guess I was 17, 18 when I officially came out to my mom, but I was 16 when I knew, 15, 16 when I knew.
Mhm.
So it was definitely first, like they thought it was a phase. I got that a lot. They
Mm.
thought it was a phase. I think the bipolar, I honestly don't know if it affected. I'm definitely more heterosexual leaning,
Mhm.
but that's only because women scare me because we feel stuff, and I
Right.
get women much more readily, and I'm enough of my own emotional havoc to
Yeah, dig it.
add a whole nother woman into that
Mhm.
whole thing.
Right.
But I love them,
Sure.
and I'm physically attracted to both.
Mhm.
But I think for me, it was always about, because I always felt so othered anyway,
Mhm.
it, I don't think it, I don't know if it added or detracted or what it did, but I think it was just another aspect of the fact that I was othered from other communities even.
Mm.
You know what I
So
mean? Like
the
I was
isolation, not
always
fitting,
different.
not
Yeah,
fitting.
I was
You were
always
really
going to be
different.
different. Like
Mhm.
I remember the first time an adult said to me when I was 5 or 6, you need to go play with your own kind. And I remember looking at him just like, well, where am I going to find that?
Mhm.
Because I knew there wasn't anyone else like me out there. And I remember my mom telling me, because having that conversation of there are going to be people out there that are going to be, she didn't use the term racist, but that are going to not like you because you're different, or going to say things like that. And you need to tell them, because one guy had erroneously called me a spick or a chink or something.
So rude. What
And
the world?
I know, and I was 5. That was the first time I got called a name.
Really?
Yeah, and it was an adult.
He's on the welcome committee of kindness already.
Yes.
You brought my Brooklyn accent out.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember her telling me, when they say that, you should tell them that if they can't call you the right slur, they don't get to call you anything.
Isn't that something?
And so I learned very early that's why I think I always tell people when they ask me what I am, I just say, yes. Because if you can guess, I got a cookie for you, because it's pretty tough for people to get it. But I don't really mind it anymore. I think I recognize, I learned to embrace my otherness just from the mere fact that, look at it out there. Look at social media. Everybody's trying to be different and to be unique, to be all these things out there. You know how many people are out there running around using the term gypsy and trying to be Japanese and trying to be Asian and trying to be, wear this dashiki and wear that kimono, and like they're pulling things all over, and the attitude towards the cultural appropriation across the board. My mom was a world cultures teacher. I grew up with people from around the world in my house. So, and my mom's best friend was William Way. William Way is the name on the LGBTQ center here in Philadelphia, the community center here, because he was her best friend. Mm-hmm. He was one of the first to die of AIDS. When I was in the juvenile clinic, he was dying of AIDS. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I got out, my mom made me go see him. And I was so embarrassed, because here this man that I loved, who was my Uncle Bill, was dying of a disease we didn't know about, the gay disease.
Or talk about, Ilona, either.
Right, or talk about. Oh yeah, this was 84, 85. Stigma. This was early. Yeah, this was early.
Stigma across the board.
And so, here's a man that when he wanted to be mayor of Philadelphia, my mom actually had to be real with him and say, Bill, nobody is ready for a gay mayor in Philadelphia. Like, you really have to think about it. He loved this city. He had the Mummers play at his New Year's Eve party every single year. He loved Philadelphia.
Oh my goodness.
And so that side right there was very hard. I'm sorry. I know we're getting close on time.
No, you're fine. I just saw another comment.
I don't know if that answered the question. I don't know if that answered the question or not. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. It's okay, Ilona. You're okay, sweetie. Let me do this though. Let me honor what's in this chat, because we're going to get ready to close, and I do want to just share some resources for everyone listening. It says here, thank you, Ilona, for sharing your story and your insight. We can all use this information to help others, especially our children. So thank you so much for sharing. You are and have been and continue to make a difference. And then it says here, in response to that last question that you asked, it says, thank you so much for answering. Yes, you answered it. Thank you. Thank you for answering. I knew that I liked boys at age 5. This is a young man writing, and came out fully in the lifestyle at 15. So thank you for being transparent. I'm close to bipolar diagnoses, and I relate to a lot of what you said. May God continue to heal you from the past. See, thank you so much for sharing, by the way, who wrote that inside of the chat. You never know. Not only are we so much better together, quite frankly, we have a lot more in common than we don't, just as humans. And I think, my heart is so full. I just want to continue to talk, but I want to be respectful of the time. The bottom line, the abbreviated version is, I genuinely feel that if we would do a better job of listening, if we would do a better job of waiting for the answer, right? And also doing the deeper work. I believe a part of what you shared tonight demonstrates consistently there was a part of you that said, hey, I need to advocate for myself. I need to find strength in this. Writing is therapeutic for me. Journaling came up the other night.
Mhm.
So what you're saying is so important and so courageous. I love you and I adore you, Ilona. Thank you for being here because you
Thank you for having me.
absolutely, Mama Bear. Absolutely. Don't you forget, listen, nothing but bear hugs and cyber sugar for you. And that is cyber sugar, CYBERSUGA. Okay, let me read these items here. And I'm going to throw these in the description box. For those of you who are listening, we are going to get ready to wrap up because I want to hold fast to the time constraint. But we talked about the LGBT community and being bisexual and how that affects everything as it relates to another layer of challenges. And so there is the Trevor Project. And I wanted to bring up the Trevor Project because I want to make sure that when Ilona teaches, and she's teaching class in session tonight, honey, okay? When she's teaching about othered communities, she actually helped us to understand how that isolation can impact a person when you feel othered within an othered community. And when it comes to the Trevor Project, there are trained counselors who are in place to support young persons in crises who are feeling suicidal, and they describe it as a safe, judgment-free place to talk. And as a person of faith, I want to stop here and just touch on this real quick. Really important to me. How you feel in your opinion. I said what I said. How you feel in your opinion about what your position is as it relates to your belief system about the LGBTQ community is non-applicable when it comes to saving lives, to walking in love, to just being a kind person. When I freely share these resources, it's not an endorsement or non-endorsement. I think people micromanage and they major in the minors and minor in the majors. It's so that I can be a better version of a real listening person. Because if I say that I love people and if I say that I care, all I'm doing is running my mouth if I don't provide the resources that work for them. So if you have a person that comes to you and says that, you know, I'm struggling because I feel suicidal, because I'm struggling because I'm bisexual, I'm struggling because I haven't come out to my parents, that is not your cue to go, well, you know what you need to do. How do you feel if someone says to you, if they start off their sentence with what you need to do? How you help is be honest, just communicate. It's okay to say, you know what, it's a community I'm not that familiar with. I'm sure that was pretty tough. What I can do is give you some resources. Are you familiar with the Trevor Project? That's love. That's walking in love. That's caring enough about the other person to long enough to table your opinion to find out what can help them. So the Trevor Project, I want to highlight it. It was founded in 1998 by the creators of the Academy Award-winning short film Trevor. And the Trevor Project is the leading national organization providing crisis intervention and suicide prevention services to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning young people under the age of 25. So I want to make sure that all you have to do is just Google them. I will again put the link down below. You can get information on the Trevor Project. If you need someone to talk to, there's an 866-488-7386 number for trained counselors. Really important. No one asked you to go into detail about what your belief systems are. It doesn't matter what your belief systems are. Do you not understand when you have a crisis and you have an emergency and you call whatever emergency support that you do, and if the paramedic gets there, do you stop them and go, I know my heart is racing and I think I'm having a heart attack, but baby, what church do you go to? We don't do that. We do not do that. Because it's not about them, it's about meeting the need. And we have to do a better job of showing up, of meeting the needs of people. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. Any last thoughts? Any other questions or concerns? A lot of feedback in the chat. Oh my goodness, you guys are so awesome. Thank you for participating. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for being patient with the technical difficulties in the very beginning. Ilona, final words, mama. Final words, mama. You tell me.
I was so glad you brought up the Trevor Project, because that was one that I looked at as well. As a mixed race, bisexual, short, overweight, all the you name it. All I can say is, you know, I hope everybody is staying well and staying safe during all of this, and that the resources are out there. And I wish they had been out there when I was young. I really wish they had. I know that, you know, I was lucky in a lot of ways because I grew up in a very diverse neighborhood. With a family with a lot of diversity. As unseen as I felt, there was definitely the access I had to understanding that being different wasn't a crime. And that it wasn't the worst thing in the world, because I still hurt the same, and I still bled the same, and I still, all these things. It's just bipolar was not on the radar for young kids at that point. That was really, really unusual. And I wish I'd had an adult that really, really got me. And like I said, I had my great aunt. She was my soft place because she didn't care what anybody labeled me. She just loved me. I was her princess in particular. But I want to thank everybody, and especially you, E. And I want to thank you for always seeing me and believing in me. And you have been one of the greatest supports ever that I've found through Instagram. And, you know, I may not be a girl of, or a believer, as you say, but I am definitely a girl who believes in something greater than myself. And I do understand that, you know, we all want the same things ultimately. We all want to be loved and cared for and understood. And at the very worst, if you can't understand somebody, help them know that even if you don't understand them, you can still love them.
That's right.
And it's still okay. So thank you. Thank you so much for having me and letting me read my poem.
Thank you so much. And we're going to end with your last line. Being different is not a crime. It's not a crime. And part of ending the stigma and dismantling all of the systems in place that divide us is walking in a new level of love, a new level of humanity and kindness, and not this facetious and action rock more than one face. No, from a genuine place. Because being different is not a crime. I like that, Mama. You're gonna mess around and stir up the poet in me, girl.
Oh, we're gonna talk more.
We're gonna definitely talk more. I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. This is Erica Arthur, again, of Inspiration with E and Authenticity Speaks. Again, if you feel as though you're in crisis or you're struggling, you are not alone. Ilona and I talked about everything tonight under the sun, and I promise you, she and I can go for a lot longer, but we're going to honor the time. And just let you know that you're not alone. I do believe that there is a purpose and a plan for your life. I do believe that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And just know that you're not alone. And even if people that you love and that you care for have not yet seen you and have not yet heard you, please know that there are trained volunteers out there. There are even peer recovery specialists, which means there are people who, that's not a hotline, it's considered a warm line. You can Google that too. Warm line means it's a peer who's currently in the process of going through the same journey, but just a tad bit stronger and a little bit more seasoned. in the space that they're in and they can talk to you, like, just know that you matter and we love you and we're rooting for you. And we're so glad that you're here. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. And thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Ilona. Thank you, Mama. Much love and respect. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Oh, they're so sweet. God bless you all, these supporters. Much love.
Good
And thank
night.
you all. Good night, everybody. Take care. Take care. Much love.
Good night.